Okay, good morning everyone, welcome. So this is the third webinar in our series for the Demand and Capacity Open Online course. I'm fairly sure most of you are familiar with it now, but if you can keep yourselves on mute if you're not asking questions, just so there isn't too much background noise. Please use Slido to ask questions, and also there's a register link which is in the chat part of the Teams meeting. So if you can just fill that in when you get a chance, it really helps us kind of keep track of our housekeeping. So there's three of us on the line today. So there's me on the left, Alice. I've been overseeing this course and I'll be joining you for all of the webinars as we go through. We've also got Paul joining us today. Do you want to say a quick hello?
Yes, good morning everyone. My name is Paul Bullard. I'm part of the team and part of the technical side of it, so part of the geek squad that's within the Demand and Capacity team, and I'll be doing some of the content today.
And we've got Natasha as well, who's been busily letting you all into from the lobby into the main room, and also is doing the Slido and all the registration links. Natasha, do you want to say a quick hello as well?
Good morning. So I'll be helping today, so if you've got any questions, please do submit them to the Slido and we'll get those answered throughout the session.
Thanks a lot. Now, talking of Slido, here's the QR code again in big, if that helps at all with people being able to connect. We'll be using it regularly throughout the session, so it's really handy if you can connect right at the start. And we will start with our first Slido question, which will be very familiar to those of you who've joined before. We've been using it each time. It's just a quick kind of check-in to see how people are doing. So have a little look at the emoji spectrum and think about which emoji is you today. So which is feeling like it sums up what you're bringing to Wednesday morning this morning. Natasha, do you want to just bring up the screen so we can see what people are putting in? Okay, good. That's always encouraging. A few okays. Tired. I mean, I relate, to be fair. I don't know about the rest of you, but it's got to the time of year now where I get up in the dark. It's not a happy place. It's not natural. I'm trying to remember to take my vitamin D every day. A bit of sleepy, yeah. And a few on the happy and super, which is always really encouraging. Paul, where would you put yourself on the emoji spectrum today?
I put myself down as super.
Ah.
There isn't one for cold, so I couldn't put that one down. But no, looking forward to this. It's going to be good.
I can't remember if you joined us for the first one, Paul, but I think for the first one we had the biggest as being tired. So it's quite nice to see that that's switched over to being the majority of people are in the good category, which I think is what we had last week as well. I can see that there's a lot of people still joining us as well, so they'll be just getting themselves onto Slido at the moment, I guess. Okay, encouraging stuff. I'm glad to see that people are feeling good. I totally relate to the tired. and the okay is just kind of the reality of how people feel on certain days. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? So our agenda for today, we're going to be looking a little bit at variation, how it works and why it's important for healthcare and planning for demand and capacity. We're also going to be looking at pathway mapping and the theory of constraints. So again, it's about looking at what that means in a demand capacity context, and also just how that can kind of apply to any projects that you're working on. It'd be interesting to hear from people actually whether you've started to work on your projects or not, or whether that's something that you're still kind of working towards. And then just to give a little bit of context of where we are in the course, so we're on module number 3 now, which is the first of 2 webinars. It's going to focus on the principles that underpin demand and capacity. So these principles are really universal no matter what service you're modelling or looking at, really. I know that the models, when we get to that, can be sometimes thought to be a bit acute focused. We're going to try and make sure that we really unpack how you can use them in community mental health, but these underpinning principles really are universal to any kind of context in any service. And then next week we'll be looking at the second part of that principles. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Paul now. He's going to talk us through the next few slides.
Thank you, Alice. Yes, and good morning to everyone. As Alice kind of alluded to, we'll be covering the principles over 2 modules because there's quite a bit to cover, and it makes sense to spend a bit more time on kind of the different sections, just to make sure that people are quite happy with what we're talking about. What I will say before we start kind of doing any of this, there's lots and lots and lots of additional resources that are available on our Future NHS site, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. So if there's something that comes up today that we don't get to cover, or there's a question that we don't get to have a look at the huge amount of resources that we've got available, because there's lots to there's a lot to kind of unpick today, and it can feel like quite a lot. But A, we're here, and B, that there's lots more reading and stuff for you to do if you feel like you need to. So having said that, let's get started with some of the principles of demand and capacity modelling. And what we've got here is kind of some key facts that have come out and have kind of tried and tested of how we can expect, or why we expect patients to wait longer to be seen than they should really be. And there's 3 things here. So patients will wait longer to be seen if the capacity of a service cannot meet its demand. And that's fairly straightforward, I think. If you don't have enough kind of that supply, then it's going to be very hard to meet your demand. Patients will wait longer to be seen if the variation in both demand and capacity are not understood, as well as the interplay between them. And we'll certainly pick this up in a couple of seconds when we look at variation and what that means for healthcare services. And patients will wait longer to be seen if the waiting list size for a service is too big, and therefore the service cannot meet its demand. And waiting lists, they get quite a bad rep in the NHS, but actually they're a really effective tool of helping to manage variation and making sure that you're able to provide a service that kind of works for your patient. And we'll talk about waiting lists a little bit more later on in the course, but it's certainly worth kind of bearing in mind at this point that you can expect your patients to wait longer if your waiting list size is too big for your service. Okay, next slide, please, Alice. Brilliant. So Wednesday morning, we've got a couple of people saying that they're tired. I said I was cold. So we're going to do something a little bit fun. We're going to play a little game. We're going to play a variation of a game that we used to play in the old world when we were doing face-to-face training, that we used to call the soldiers game. And for those of you that have read either The Goal by Eli Goldratt or Pride and Joy by Alex Knight, this might feel familiar. And they're 2 books on the theory of constraints, and we'll talk about the theory of constraints a little bit later, but this is a really good kind of representation of how a service and how variation within a service works. So just to give you the kind of the high level overview, we're going to have our patient pathway, and we are going to kind of randomly assign capacity between 1 patient being seen and 6 patients being seen for each of our steps in our pathway. And we're going to do this 10 times, and we're going to see how the patients flow through our service, and eventually how many patients we can actually see or treat at the end of kind of 10 weeks of simulated of simulated work. So let me load up the game. Can I just get a nod?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Excellent, perfect. Okay, so here's our setup. So we have our GP who will be pushing referrals out into our patient pathway. And our patient pathway is quite simple at this stage. Let's keep it nice and simple. It's a demonstration. So we have kind of an initial clinic. We have some sort of diagnostic services, some sort of theatre pre-assessment, then into our theatres, then recovery. And once they've gone through recovery, we can say that the patient is being treated, they've been seen, they come out of our system at the end. And we can see that we've got kind of waiting lists already existing in each of our stages. So we've got 4 in our clinic, diagnostic, pre-assessment, theatres, and recovery. And we have this kind of this whole population of 60 that could come out from our GP. And then we have our little spinners. So we will spin these all at the same time, and we'll have a value. So we might have 4 from our GP and 4 patients from our GP will move into our clinic. Whatever we have in the clinic will move into diagnostics, etc. So before I ask you a question, I'm just going to do a quick demonstration. So I'll hit the spin. Okay, so we had 6 patients that have moved from our GP into our clinic. So we can see that's reduced down to 54. In our clinic, we saw all 4 of those patients that were in our waiting lists. They've all gone down here, but the 6 from the GP are now sitting in our clinic. And this follows through. Now, pre-assessment, we had 4 patients that were waiting, but we had the ability to see 6, but because we only had the 4 patients there, those 2 additional slots were lost. We couldn't actually fill them, so only 4 patients would have filled through into theatres, where we have our initial 4 minus the 2 that would have moved to recovery, plus the 4 that came from pre-assessment. Hopefully that makes sense. That feeds through quite nicely. So back on Slido now, we're going to ask you, if that was 1 round, how many people do we think our system can treat after 10 rounds? So we're going to do this 9 more times. How many patients do we think will be sitting in that treated after 10 rounds, 10 weeks of simulation? Considering our average will be 3.5, so it'll be in between this 3 and this 4. After 10 rounds, how many can we expect to be sitting in this treated? I'll give you just kind of 30 seconds, 45 seconds just to think about that. Cool, so we can see some of them coming through. 35 popular, 40 popular. Where's our lowest? 23. Not very confident in our healthcare.
There's a 60 in there as well.
And a 60, very confident in our healthcare system.
$35 and $40, both quite popular so far, with 30 as a kind of runner-up. $36.
Okay, 5 more seconds for any last guesses. 2, 1. Okay, so 35 is our most popular, and that does make sense, because if we're expecting 3.5 each time, and we're doing it for 10 rounds, we can expect 35 patients to be treated. Now, does this happen?
I think that's quite a sort of natural assumption that people use when planning services as well, in terms of what we're expecting and what feels instinctively like what would happen.
Absolutely.
Yep, can see it up again.
Excellent. Okay, so let's quickly kind of run through this again then, and let's do this now for these 9 additional weeks. So that's 1. And keep an eye where we start to see some backlogs building up, where we start to see some waiting lists growing. And so that's now our week 3, our week 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay. So anyone that said 35, they're going to be getting a call from their manager saying, well, you said we could treat 35 patients, but we've only seen 31. And we can also see that we haven't met that kind of that average expected patients being treated or seen, but also our waiting list has slightly grown. So we had 20 in our waiting list to start off with, and that's actually grown to 22 as well. So we have not only not met our
Expected
treated
performance.
our treated performance, but we've increased our waiting list at the moment. And we can see that for some of these that they've got quite a bit bigger. So we've got 6 and 7 in our clinics and our recovery, and some, you know, that it's not so bad. But we can see that there's variation. So there's variation between how many patients can be seen each week, but also how many patients are moving into your system or your part of the pathway each week as well. And so trying to unpick this variation without kind of a structured approach to it can be really, really difficult. So we're going to run this again, and we're going to do a kind of quite a classic NHS management approach. And it's been 10 weeks and we've seen that we've only treated 31 patients. So we're going to go, right, so you said 35. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you another resource. I'm going to give you another spinner. And you can put this kind of wherever you put some additional capacity in wherever you want. And hopefully that will mean that you can increase your patients seen and treated. And normally, well, they'll put it is in diagnostics. Okay, it's obviously the diagnostics department's fault. They're the hold up. So let's put it into our diagnostics. So now in our diagnostic department, we could see somewhere between 2 and 12 patients. And let's see what happens by adding in this additional resource, see how many more patients we can treat. So we'll run through these 10 weeks again.
You can really see the effect of the diagnostics having those 2 spinners, because there's basically hardly any waiting list at diagnostics at all.
Okay, so it's 10 weeks later, and we've given you 6 additional slots in your diagnostics department, and you've treated 4 patients less. And how often does that happen in the NHS where we don't understand this variation? And not only that, we've treated less, we've got more patients in our system, so we've gone from 20 up to 23, but also look at the backlog that we've created further downstream from that additional spinner. We've now got 11 patients that are waiting in that pre-assessment because the pre-assessment capacity just wasn't enough to keep up with the additional kind of work that was being generated by that diagnostics department. And this is kind of really, really important to understand that both your demand and your capacity within sections of a pathway will vary, and understanding how that variation works is really, really key to understanding your demand and capacity position. And this is, this is a basic simulation, but hopefully it kind of demonstrates that that imbalance and that variability, and how failing to plan for that variability can be really kind of detrimental to performance, which is one, but also think about these 11 patients that are waiting here and how much longer they're going to have to wait for an appointment, to have that pre-assessment. You know, with there's the whole kind of patient experience kind of ideas that are sitting here as well, with these 11 patients that are waiting.
And you'll there's a link to this game on the Future NHS site. So if you look at the further resources section, because I can see a few people in the chat box have been asking about it, you can play this game, and there's a third round where you get to move the resource in between. There's also a link to some dice, like online dice game that Alex Knight has produced, who wrote Pride and Joy, and they're also on the Future NHS platform. A link to them is, so you can have a little look at that. I think one of his versions you can actually specify what the range of variation is for the different steps, so you've got a whole gambit of kind of options to play with to see how these things pan out.
Absolutely. Okay, can we go back to the slides then, please, Alice? So yeah, so do have a go with this on the e-learning for healthcare website. It can be quite a good competition, see who can see who can get the most patients treated at any time, especially when you get to drag the resources around. But it's quite a good demonstration of that variability. And so, you know, I could spend an hour talking about what this is showing us, and what we could do to improve this system. But some of the kind of the key observations from doing an exercise like this is that it's key to understand that both your demands, so what's coming into your service, and your capacity, which was the kind of the spinner, are variable. Sometimes you won't have enough capacity, so we really saw that in that pre-assessment where we were building up that backlog. And sometimes you will have more capacity than you can use. And when we come to looking at waiting lists, that's really where they can be useful to help kind of spread out some of that variation.
Paul, we've got a few questions that have come through on Slido, so I've just,
yeah.
If it's all right, I might just read out a few of these because I think it will kind of unpack some of the stuff that's on the screen as well. So we've got one person saying wait lists will increase in size if patients do not want to be seen, e.g. COVID. So I think that's quite particularly at the moment, it's a big part of why waiting lists are growing. And again, that could feed into that variability. So when we were looking at the spinners and when it's going between 1 and 6, that variability of when you give a patient an appointment and whether they come or not, whether they want to come or not, will, I think at the moment, probably feed into a higher range of variation than we might normally see in terms of attendances. And then another question here, does the model assume that there is the same capacity at each stage of the process?
So that's what the spinner was representing, was the available capacity at each of those stages, and how that varies kind of, in this example, kind of round on round, but it's week on week, day on day. Yeah. So that's what the spinner was trying to represent.
And again, I think if you look at the Alex Knight versions, you can tweak that, so there is different capacity at each stage if that's something that you're wanting to investigate, because obviously it plays out in different ways. But yeah, for the example we were doing, it is all the same. And then there's a question here saying, is there a model that you can recommend and share to help me calculate what capacity is needed to clear a waiting list and backlog, waiting list time and backlog?
So you're on the right course. The the core model that will be discussed later on in the course does that for you. It will give you the kind of the key metrics in terms of your demand and capacity balance, but also in terms of your waiting list size, where that waiting list size should be, and that calculation will all be explained and talked about later on, and it will show you how to get back into a kind of an ideal waiting list size range. So yes, you're on the right course for that sort of question.
I can add to the resources for this module the link to that to the core model if people are interested in looking at it now. It's also on our kind of main web pages. Additionally, there's a COVID model which we've, I say we, Paul and Keith have very quickly produced, and that looks specifically at the waiting list that was created because of that gap of referrals not being seen. So if, depending on whether you're looking at kind of an ongoing waiting list clearance or specifically COVID, I'll put a link to both of those in the future NHS site as well. There are a couple more questions, but I think we'll come to those later on. People who, if someone's posted a question you're really interested in, there is a like button, and it does really help us if people like things, because then we will make sure we answer those questions first. So please do keep asking questions, guys, and we'll make sure that we cover those at various points throughout the webinar today.
Cool. And then the last kind of point on this slide that I just want to just quickly talk about is that additional resources at one fixed point in the system doesn't always help. And I think we really saw that with the diagnostics into the pre-assessment, that actually all we're doing is we're just then front loading that pre-assessment with more work than they can handle. So the kind of the easy answer is generally to try and put more clinics on, or hire some new staff to do some diagnostics work, or something like that. And that actually, when you look at the entire system, all you're really doing is is pushing the problem around. And there's a much better way of kind of understanding the whole system approach and understanding what this means downstream from just adding additional capacity in. Okay, so some signs and symptoms that you might have a demand and capacity problem. And these aren't exhaustive, but it's just from kind of our experience. It's just tends to be what kind of indicates that there might be a demand and capacity problem. So there's the failure of national access standards. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to pick out what's what now with post-COVID. Your waiting list getting bigger, and again, it's a little bit more difficult. But still, if you're seeing your waiting list growing, so our pre-assessment in the example, if we're seeing that growing, it's a kind of a sign that perhaps there's a demand and capacity imbalance. Increasing incomplete RCT clearance times. Again, a little bit harder to pick out, but still of interest. A rise in patient complaints. Now, this is really interesting because it's might not be something that's necessarily kind of seen within the gift of kind of the data analyst kind of department within a trust. But if you have a demand and capacity imbalance, you are going to see a rise in patient complaints in terms of waiting times, in terms of clinic availabilities, all that sort of stuff. So you will start to see that. And again, very similar, deterioration of patient experience metrics. If you find that you are having to put on waiting list initiatives and additional sessions, again, it's an indication that you might have a demand and capacity imbalance. The increase in the use of private sector capacity, so that outsourcing, and also, and this is a really, really important one, is staff feedback. If staff feel like they are running at 1,000 miles an hour and not making any headway, again, it's an indication that you might have a demand and capacity imbalance. And so this is part of a document on breach analysis that we'll make sure is available. And it kind of, some of the reasons why you might have breaches are these kind of these unnecessary waits because of insufficient capacity, and that's kind of one reason. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a demand and capacity problem. There could be other reasons why you're having breaches. So is it that your hospital cancellations are too high? Diagnostic delays. I know that we talked about diagnostic capacity, but is there problems there? The medically not fit, the pre-assessments, are these kind of affecting your breaches? Are there processing delays? Are there late transfers from other providers, other local issues? You know, it's a whole range of reasons why patients might be breaching that RTT standard. It's not always a capacity issue. So the temptation can be to jump straight into, we've got a problem, it's a demand and capacity problem. Let's go and do a whole kind of project of demand and capacity modeling. And actually, it might not be the case that that is the biggest kind of blocker or the biggest kind of problem that you have. So what we'll talk about in a second is identifying if it is a demand and capacity problem.
Yeah, and I think particularly with COVID disrupting things so much at the moment, it's worth looking at some of these other potential causes at the same time. And it really links back to what we talked about in the previous webinar around being clear what your question is and what you're trying to find out by doing the modelling, because it really can be a whole range of things that would be causing these symptoms.
And so the first step, if you are thinking about doing demand and capacity modeling, or you've identified that you have kind of a higher than expected number of breaches, or a longer patients are waiting too long for in your service, or your waiting list is too big, the first real step that you have to do is pathway mapping. And that I mean, you know, this is an 8-hour course on its own on pathway mapping. So we're going to give you the high level with some additional resources on this. But essentially, what you're trying to do is work out what typically happens. So how do you expect patients to move through your service kind of normally? In what order does that happen? So, you know, they're going to have their referral, their first appointment, some sort of diagnostics, perhaps some sort of pre-assessment, into theatres, into recovery, into follow-ups. You know, so what order does this normally happen? When should it happen? So, you know, within kind of 6 weeks, you want your diagnostics done, and then obviously within kind of maybe 10, 12, 14 weeks, you want your surgery done. And what is the maximum wait for each stage? So if we're saying that we want our first outpatient appointments to happen within 6 weeks, you know, we want them mostly to be waiting for those 6 weeks. And it's picking out these parts for each kind of stage in your pathway, and pulling those apart and kind of mapping those out. And you'll see it quite often with big brown sheets of paper and post-it notes, and just working with colleagues, so with clinical colleagues, with admin staff, with everyone, just to work out actually, okay, what is the process, what is the pathway that we're expecting patients to follow.
So two things. One, there is a webinar that was hosted over a summer series looking specifically at pathway mapping and in the context of COVID. So if people are interested in that, that's on Future NHS. And I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with pathway mapping or you're not really sure where to start, that's a really good guide. We've also got quite a few questions. So before we go on to the rest of the pathway mapping thing, I just thought we'd pause slightly. So we've got a question from the Spinner game. Why are people left at the GP stage after round 10? Surely they would sit on the clinic waiting list.
So no, that's kind of, so it's kind of, they maybe shouldn't have 60 on there, but that's the entire population. So that's kind of everyone within the local area. So they're sitting there because they might not need healthcare services. You know, it's just a representation of the entire population that could potentially come into our service, into our pathway.
Yeah, they're not included in the total of who's waiting either. So it's about people who could be potentially referred in rather than people who will or have been referred in. There's another question that's got quite a few likes. Is there a model that you recommend and share to help? Oh, we've answered that one already. Is it possible to look at some management principles in supply chain management, just in time, and pool management systems in designing your model? So we don't go through that in this course. There is reference to it in the goal. So if you are interested in kind of more of that and kind of understanding how that works, there definitely is a lot of material around it. It's not I said what we focus on in our model. Our model is looking more at that kind of sustainability of an ongoing system. But I can also see that particularly at the moment, there's a lot of changes happening quite quickly. It could be useful. So yeah, the goal definitely, and I think Pride and Joy as well, because it covers very similar content, has got some of that looking at how you can kind of pull rather than push, if that makes sense. If that doesn't answer your question, please do follow up either via the chat here, or if you post it on the chat function in future NHS, we can look at that as if that's something you're interested in, and potentially post some more resources. Someone's put in a comment here. I want to make an analogy to transport planning where a new road scheme can move the jam from a few miles down the road. I think that is a really good analogy, actually. We often use the weather in terms of predicting, but I think that traffic thing is actually quite a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, and that that is exactly it. Is that it feels like you're solving a problem, and actually you're not. You're moving the problem, and so what a good kind of demand and capacity analysis can hopefully do, or can give you the tools to do at least, is to appreciate that kind of that downstream effect and take a look at that as a kind of a whole system approach. And this is why the pathway mapping is really important, because it's about understanding those interconnectivity of the different stages, and help you kind of model, okay, if we do this at this stage, what's the effect later on. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so when we're thinking about the pathway mapping, that first example is that we had earlier is a pretty basic one, and actually when we look at healthcare pathways, they are kind of immeasurably complex. And one of the big things that we see is these feedback loops. So you might go from your first outpatients into diagnostics, into kind of pre-assessment, and then something will happen, so you have to go back to diagnostics and then back into your pre-assessment, and you can follow these loops around. This is particularly pertinent in long-term and kind of complex groups of patients, especially mental health and community settings, and we have a model for that as well, that we don't go into huge detail about on this course, but we have lots and lots of resources available for that as well. So if that's if you feel like this is how your service works, perhaps you've got a community service where you're seeing patients over kind of 2-3 years. They sit on a caseload, and they're constantly kind of in the service and coming back for treatment or for appointments or for contacts. Then we can model that as well. We can model these feedback loops.
So there's again, Future NHS in the resources page, there's a link to the high complexity model, which looks at this sort of caseload or looping back round modelling. If this is something that you think might apply to your services and that you want to use, have a little look. There's a really good walkthrough which takes you through how the model works and exactly what sort of data you'd need to use it. As Paul said, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on that model in this course, because actually not that many people use the high complexity model, and it's not relevant for a lot of services. But if it is relevant for your service and it's kind of part of the project you're doing, that might be one to bring up. We are quite happy to go into detail with individuals about how to use it if that's something that's useful. We're just not going to cover it in the course because actually for a lot of people it's something that they never use. So do have a look and think about whether that's something that you want to look at in more detail, or that you kind of want to understand a bit more the ins and outs of it. Okay, so we're going to go on to our next Slido question. So if you go onto your Slido tab or phone or whatever, and we're looking at how well do you think you understand your patient pathway and how it relates to the project that you're doing as part of this course. So we're using one as being, I mean, hopefully no one will actually tick one, but one is being what is a patient? So you're just not in that world at all, and you haven't really got a sense of it. And then 10 is that you live and breathe the experience of your patients. So it's really kind of what you're doing day in, day out, and the kind of big part of how you're working and what you're going to be doing. So interesting. The 5 to 8 is definitely where a lot of people are sitting. A few 10s and 1s, which is fair enough. But yeah, definite skew to the right. As we said earlier on, so pathway mapping is one of those things that is really, really valuable piece of work. So when Matthew in the first module was talking about that detective work element of doing demand and capacity work, demand and capacity planning, I do think that the pathway mapping is definitely one of those areas where you become part-time detective to figure it out. And it's really, again, going back to what Lily was saying in that first session, and Rich was also saying in the last one with the stakeholder mapping, working in silos is a bit of a disaster when you try and do this. So it's very easy to presume that you know what your pathway is. I've heard some great stories from some of our graduates of the Demand and Capacity Trainer Programme who said, you know, they gave me this lovely pathway map. They said, we've got this beautiful map of our patient pathway. The only thing wrong with it is that we have yet to find a single patient who's followed it. And the reality often is a lot messier than what we would plan for or want it to be. But it's really, really useful to have that kind of collaborative conversation to get a picture of what's happening, and then at least have a bit more of a heads up of if you solve the problem in one place, where you are pushing it down the line, or where down the line is. Okay, so I'd say 6 is a solid solid favourite. Thank you for that. Thanks for everyone who's participated. It's really interesting to see where people are sitting.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's not surprising that it's somewhere around that kind of that middle, but it is really, really important if you are trying to do if you're thinking about doing demand and capacity modeling, to understand that patient pathway, to make sure that it is that demand and capacity imbalance that's causing the problems, and it's not just kind of process issues, and it's not just you know, other stuff that's happening. But it will also help you then later on down the line when you are starting to think about implementing changes and kind of quantifying the impact that those changes will have. Cool. Okay, so very much linked with your pathway mapping is then this big scary thing that we call the theory of constraints. And actually it's not too bad. It's fairly straightforward. It's something that I think people do and account for all the time, but just don't understand that or don't kind of put it into the words of oh, I'm acting on the theory of constraints at the moment. It's something that you do but don't realize you're doing. And what essentially really we're talking about here is kind of patient flow, your bottlenecks, and your constraints. And so again, because I work best with really simple things, we've got a patient pathway. We've got our first outpatients appointments into kind of the pathology lab, from which the patients then move to some sort of diagnostic, so MRI, and then into follow-up outpatient appointments. And we can see that, you know, each of our different stages, our first outpatient appointments can see 10 patients per week. A pathology lab isn't working very hard and they can only see 10 patients per week. Our MRI department or our MRI scanner, that's really not working very hard and can only see 6 patients per week. And then in our follow-up outpatient appointments, we can see those 10 patients per week again. And the kind of the rhetorical question that we've got there is, what is the maximum number of patients that can pass through our pathway on any given week? And the kind of the answer is 6. So you're limited. Your entire system flow is governed by your constraint. So even though you're working really hard in your first outpatient appointment, you're pushing 10 patients through per week, where you've got that kind of that rate limiting factor in the MRI at 6 patients per week. That's the kind of the expected system flow for this pathway. And so, and again, because this is it can be quite a scary concept. If we think about it in this way, so we have our demand, which is all of the requests for a service. We then have our step or our stage in our pathway, that is our bottleneck or our constraint, which is our rate limiting factor. So our capacity is set at that level. So it's as we're working as hard as we can at that bottleneck and constraint. We know that there's a difference between what we'll book in and what we'll actually do, because there's things like DNAs, hospital cancellations, short notice cancellations, all that sort of stuff. So we then have our activity, so what we actually did from our available capacity. And anything in our demand that's not caught in that activity becomes backlog or queue or our waiting list. And what you'll generally find is that your constraint is the availability of a specific space, skill, or piece of equipment. We put space in, particularly now with COVID. If you can only have X amount of people in your waiting room at any kind of given time, that's going to be your biggest constraint at the moment. But also there's things like specific skills or specific bits of equipment. So scanners tends to be the big one that we find. And so how can you kind of solve this problem of having a bottleneck or a constraint? And this is from Eli Goldratt and his kind of 5 focusing steps that he put together to reconfigure constraints. So your first step is to identify your constraint, to work out where it is. That will come from your pathway mapping and seeing where your waiting lists are kind of their biggest. Step 2 is to maximize the use of that constraint. So if there's any kind of downtime at all, so if it is a scanner and it shuts down for 2 hours at lunchtime because everyone kind of goes off and has their lunch, actually, is there a way that you could shift the rotor so that you're covering that, so that it is running across those 2 hours, and so you're maximizing the use of that constraint? Tune your system around your constraint is the third step, and what we essentially are talking about there is, can you do stuff kind of either side of that constraint to make sure that you're maximizing the use of that constraint? So can you stop pushing so much into it? Is there a different pathway that the patients could take? Is there something else that you could do so that you're not pushing as much work into that constraint? And then the fourth step, and this is the one that tends to happen first, is you increase the throughput of your constraint. And that generally means putting money or time into the constraint to increase its capacity. So that might be buying a new machine, hiring a new consultant or nurse or doctor, or putting up a porter cabin to increase your waiting room size, things like that. So it's increasing the throughput of that constraint. And then once you've done those 4 steps, it's really, really important that you then go to step number 5, which is you go back to step number 1, identify where your new constraint is, and then go through those steps again. So that kind of that constant movement to make sure that you're maximizing your system and its constraints wherever you can.
And if this is something, so I think theory of constraints is a really interesting one. In lots of ways, it's not very difficult to get your head around. And Paul's right. I think a lot of people are doing this without necessarily giving it the label of theory of constraints. There's a lot of information in the books, The Goal and Pride and Joy. So there are links to those books on the Future NHS platform. You can also find them secondhand relatively cheaply if you don't want to pay full price. You know, the text hasn't really changed since it was published well, The Goal was published in the 80s, and I think Pride and Joy was published in the early 2000s. I'm not 100% sure, but in the 2000s. But the core text, the theory in there is really solid. Both of them, to give you just a little warning, are written in a kind of novel style. So they're trying to make it come to life with a story and a narrative. The Goal particularly is of its time. So I would say take the Goal storyline with a pinch of salt. Things have changed a bit since the mid-80s. But the theory that's in there is absolutely solid. So we're going to take you back over to Slido again for another question. So what do you think might be a constraint in your system or service? So when you're thinking about your project or just generally where you're working, what do you think is the constraint that you're seeing as being one that's kind of the limiting factor or the bottleneck for your service? Diagnostics, workforce vacancies. Me, that's very honest. While that's while people are entering into that, we've just got a few questions as well, which I thought we could have a look at. So the one that's got the most likes is informatics staff are bound to score this as low understanding of pathway mapping. I think that's fair in terms of the different kind of specialties. So people who are more operationally involved probably will be living and breathing the patient pathway a bit more. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to very quickly load up a little diagram that Matthew actually put together. In terms of the kind of, and I know this is principles rather than practice for demand and capacity, but I think it's really important, and you might see this later on as well. Let me just. Here's a problem with trying to show stuff, put stuff together live, but it's a really powerful, I think, representation of, because yes, we know that kind of data analysts might not necessarily know patient pathways inside out. Here we go.
So workforce and staff is coming up really big on this word cloud as a theme.
And if you don't mind, Natasha, I'm just going to take over 2 seconds, and I've dropped it into Paint. And I said I was part of the Geek Squad earlier, and I'm just really not showing up. I'm really not, am I? But this is kind of a quartet approach that we consider to work really well with demand and capacity planning. So you're going to have your business intelligence, your data analyst kind of stuff, who are part of this integral team, but their kind of their input is the service or systems understanding. So they'll have a little bit of that. Their technical skills, they need to be able to interpret data and try and make kind of some of the outputs a little bit simpler. But they don't do this in a silo, and quite often we'll find that people are expecting their business intelligence people to be doing modeling in a silo. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
That happened to me on my first webinar. For those of you who joined me, I completely lost my voice. It was very inconvenient. Matthew had to take over.
But the other side of it is that they work as part of this team with service leads who should know the patient pathway maps really well, or at least will know who to talk to kind of to figure it out. And then you have these critical friends who come in and are kind of the translator, do the humble inquiry kind of stuff, and kind of just check, challenge, and make sure that these two are kind of are working in synergy. And then finally, the kind of one of the really big things that tends to get missed is that senior leadership, so that executive buy-in and things like that, that are really important to making sure that the project works well. So yes, absolutely, 100% agree. Your business intelligence or your data analysts probably don't understand the patient pathway, as well as your service leads or your senior leadership or your clinicians as well. And clinicians really should be in here as well. But it's part of working as this project team that's really important. Sorry, Natasha, you can go back to the email.
Natasha, do you want to bring up the questions? Actually, that's probably so. There's a few questions that have come in. Could you overlap pathway mapping with lean mapping? Absolutely. There's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do both of those and kind of interweave them together, especially if it means that you can kill two birds with one stone as such. I think you need to be a bit careful in terms of engaging with people and making sure you're clear about what it's feeding into and how it's going to be used. Because if someone has heard lean and then it's been used for something else, it can just kind of end up with people getting a bit muddled. But as long as your messaging is clear, I absolutely don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to weave them in together. Are there any good books about theory of constraints which aren't novels? So I would say books, not that I'm aware of, doesn't mean that they don't exist. The books that people have found the most useful have been The Goal and Pride and Joy. But if you're interested in the theory without the storyline, I would say there's lots and lots of resources online. So we can probably find a few, but equally, if you just Google theory of constraints, there's lots of kind of pure theory available online. Most people have found the novels more helpful. I mean, they are a bit cheesy at times, but there is something about seeing it apply to real life, or not real life, but to an example that can really help bring it to life. Also, if anyone does find anything that they find particularly useful in that front, please do post it in the chat function on Future NHS, because we're really interested in finding out what resources people are using and how you're finding it. So here we go. The Goal is available on eBay for £2.94 delivered at the moment. Plenty of copies available. Yeah, as I said, there's no reason to buy it new. There are lots of different places you can get it secondhand, and it is quite affordable. So, you know, save a few trees and yourself some money would be my advice. There's a difference between how well you understand the steps in the pathway and how much of it you can see in the data. Ooh,
That's a
good.
really good, yeah, a very a good question, or a good point, at least. And this is the kind of the trade-off between kind of the real high quality data and the kind of the good enough. So generally, obviously, what we want, what we'd the ideal would be, you know, that you can pull off the data and it's robust and it's good quality, and it is available for each of the steps and each of the, you know, each pathway. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, perfect. It just doesn't tend to work that way. So there are ways around that. So you'll see us later talking about undertaking things like audits, or taking samples, or doing kind of the time in motion, or you know, just sitting in a clinic and seeing how many patients are coming in, how much time is taking, and all that sort of stuff. But yes, it's a very good point, and it's there are techniques around it, because we know that can be a bit of a problem.
I am very aware of time and that people will have meetings booked in at 11 o'clock. So for those of you who need to dash off, absolutely do. But before you go, if you could fill in our evaluation questionnaire, that would be really, really useful. We do change things. So for example, people raised that they wanted to be able to see the slides just before the session started. And as of this morning, we've put the slides onto Future NHS just before we started. So if there's anything else that people feel would be really useful, we want to know so that we can make this as kind of relevant and yeah, as fit for purpose as possible. There were also quite a few comments around it going too slowly, but then there was also quite a lot of comments saying that people really appreciated it going at a speed that they could kind of keep pace with it and really understand things before we moved on. And then there were other people saying we're going too fast. So I'm aware we've got a mixed range of people on this course. If there's more detail you want to go into and you feel like we're not going quickly enough, maybe bring that up in a mentoring session. Equally, if we're going too fast, let us know and we can probably help to kind of unpick things in those sessions as well. If you're in the Goldilocks position in the middle, if we're going the right speed, I'm really glad. But do keep telling us and we will try and tweak to make sure that we're making this work for as many of you as possible. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we have read the comments and we are trying to make sure that this course fits what you need it to be. So if you could just click on that evaluation link, that would be great. And for those of you who need to get off, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
And for those of you that are staying, I really hope that the anonymous person that's asked, how do you tackle high demand and insufficient capacity when the finance to increase capacity is not available, is still on, because that's a really good question, and it's kind of gets to the heart of the theory of constraints and the 5 focusing steps. In as much as if you can identify, maximize the use of your constraint and tune your system around your constraint, you can generally do that without cost. So this is all about kind of thinking about processes and how different steps in your pathway, how those processes actually kind of work, without having to pump more capacity in terms of time or money into it. So when we're thinking about maximizing the use of our constraint, as I kind of alluded to earlier, we're talking about, you know, is there downtime that can be reduced? Is there a different way of working that means that you can increase the throughput of that constraint just through kind of process changes? And then that tuning your system around your constraint, is there a way that you can either limit the amount going into that constraint or into that section of the pathway, or is there, you know, is there a different way that you can kind of reconfigure the pathway to make sure you're not overloading that constraint? And generally these can be done in the kind of in the soft way, by looking at processes and by looking at kind of operating procedures and things like that, without having to increase that throughput of the constraint by adding money. If there's a specific kind of example that you want to talk through, I think that's the perfect example of a mentoring session, and we can actually kind of chew through some of the different process changes that you might want to consider.